Zaria Monroe had learned, over 3.5 decades of life, that the ache of not knowing where you came from never truly leaves you. It settles into the quiet corners of a person, waking up at odd hours, whispering during moments that should have been peaceful. She had built a life anyway. A career as an archival historian at the Grantham Museum, a modest apartment filled with books, and a marriage she had once believed was built on something real. She thought the deepest pain she would ever carry was the absence of a family tree. She was wrong. The truth would arrive with sirens and black cars, and a man kneeling on her doorstep, and it would begin with the very person who was supposed to know her best, deciding she wasn't worth knowing at all. Her mornings had a rhythm she found comforting. Coffee brewed slowly while she read through digitized shipping ledgers, the quiet walk to the museum past the same bakery, the same crossing guard, the same worn steps she had climbed 1,000 times. She liked the predictability of old documents, the way history, once written, could not be rewritten by anyone's ambition or cruelty. Perhaps that was part of why she had fallen in love with Ethan in the first place, because in the beginning he had seemed steady too, a man who spoke plainly and did not flinch from difficult conversations. She remembered their early years fondly, long walks after his law classes. The way he used to say that most people around him wore masks and she simply refused to own one. It had felt, back then, like the beginning of something honest. Ethan Calloway had not always been cruel. When they met nearly 10 years earlier, he had been drawn to the steadiness in her, the way she spoke without performing, the way she looked at old photographs and letters like they held entire universes. He used to say that her honesty was rare, that most people in his world wore masks and she simply didn't own one. They married after 3 years together, and for a while it felt like enough. 7 years passed. There were no children, a private grief they rarely discussed anymore, folded away like the letters Zaria kept in a drawer she never opened. And somewhere in those years, as Ethan climbed toward partnership at one of the city's most prestigious law firms, something in him hardened. It started small. A remark about her clothes before a firm dinner. A suggestion that she stay quiet when his colleagues discussed matters of family lineage and old money. Then, it grew louder. He began to speak of her background, the way one might speak of a stain that refused to lift. She had been adopted as an infant, raised by a kind but modest woman who had passed away 9 years earlier, and she had never known her birth parents. To Ethan, this absence became a liability. He needed connections, legacy, a wife whose name opened doors. Instead, he had a woman with no family behind her, no history he could point to, nothing to leverage in the rooms where his ambition lived. The night everything cracked open was a firm gala, the kind of evening filled with crystal glasses and practiced laughter. Zaria stood beside Ethan as his partners circled, asking about her family, her people, the usual polite interrogations of the wealthy. She answered honestly, the way she always had, saying she did not know much about where she came from. Ethan's jaw tightened. Then, loud enough for the small crowd around them to hear, he said the words that would end everything between them. "She doesn't even know who she is," he said, a faint, cutting smile on his face. "For all any of us know, she's been living her whole life inside a story someone made up for her." The group laughed, the kind of laughter that exists only to please the person who told the joke. Zaria did not laugh. She stood very still, her wineglass steady in her hand, though something inside her chest had folded in on itself. She had spent years absorbing his small cruelties, telling herself it was stress, it was ambition, it was a passing storm. But this was different. This was Ethan choosing, in front of an audience, to turn her deepest wound into entertainment. She scanned the faces around her, searching for even one person who looked uncomfortable, one person who might step in and change the subject the way a decent friend would. No one did. A woman in an emerald gown offered a sympathetic smile that did nothing to soften the moment, and a man beside Ethan clapped him lightly on the shoulder as though he had delivered a clever line at a dinner party rather than humiliated his own wife. Zaria set her glass down carefully on a passing tray, her hands remarkably steady, considering how violently everything inside her had shifted. She did not cry that night. She simply excused herself early, offering a polite goodbye to no one in particular, And on the ride home in silence, staring out at the blurred lights of the city, she understood that whatever they had once shared was already gone, and only the paperwork remained. A week later, Ethan asked for the divorce. He did not raise his voice. He was, in fact, remarkably calm. The calm of a man who has already made peace with a decision and only needs to inform the other party. He told her the firm expected more from a partner's wife: connections, pedigree, a story that added weight to his name rather than subtracting from it. Zaria listened without interrupting. When he finished, she asked only one question: whether he had ever loved her at all, or simply the idea of who she might become. He did not answer. She took that silence as answer enough. She returned to their apartment the following weekend to collect what remained of her old life: boxes and folders, a modest inheritance of belongings from a marriage that had quietly expired long before the paperwork caught up. She worked methodically, sorting through drawers and shelves, setting aside what mattered and discarding what did not, refusing to let the process turn into mourning. In the back of her closet sat a container she had not opened in years, a plain wooden box that had belonged to her adoptive mother, the woman who raised her with warmth even when she had little else to offer. Zaria had always assumed the box held nothing more than old photographs and keepsakes, the small artifacts every family accumulates and rarely revisits. Her mother had passed 9 years earlier, quietly, in her sleep, after a long illness that had drained the household of savings but never of affection. Zaria had packed the box away after the funeral, without truly examining its contents, unwilling at the time to sit with grief any longer than necessary. She had never had the courage, or perhaps the readiness, to look closely, and something about the timing now, with her marriage freshly ended, made the box feel less like an object and more like a door she had finally been given permission to open. That evening, alone in her new small apartment, she finally opened it. Inside, she found a stack of yellowed photographs, a faded certificate with one corner scorched as though it had survived a fire, and a pendant on a delicate chain, engraved with a symbol she did not recognize, something between a compass and a crest. Beneath everything lay an envelope, sealed, her name written across the front in handwriting she did not know. She opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a short letter, written many years earlier, the ink faded but still legible. It read simply that if the day ever came when she had nowhere left to turn, she should carry the pendant, because it would tell her who she truly was. Zaria sat with the letter for a long while, the apartment silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic below. She turned the pendant over in her palm, tracing the strange engraving with her thumb, wondering who had written those words and why they had never reached her sooner. She did not sleep well that night, and in the days that followed, she began to notice something odd, a sensation of being watched, a dark sedan parked too long outside her building, a stranger who seemed to appear wherever she went, always at a careful distance, never quite close enough to explain himself. She told herself it was nerves, the natural paranoia of a woman whose marriage had just ended and whose sense of safety had been shaken loose. But the feeling persisted, growing sharper each week. A car idling too long at the corner, a figure lingering near the entrance of her building at hours when no one had reason to be there. She began varying her route home, glancing over her shoulder more than she cared to admit, wondering whether grief was simply beginning to distort her judgment. One gray afternoon, as she left the museum after a long shift cataloging old maritime records, a woman approached her directly on the sidewalk, her posture composed, her tone deliberate in a way that suggested years of practice, delivering difficult information calmly. The woman introduced herself as Vivian Rhodes, lead counsel for a family office, and asked, with unsettling precision, whether Zaria would be willing to provide a sample of her genetic material for testing. Zaria's first instinct was suspicion. She had read enough stories about scams, targeting vulnerable people to assume this was some elaborate con, designed to exploit a woman, recently divorced and visibly unsettled, and she refused, walking briskly away without another word, her heart pounding the entire walk home. Vivian did not disappear as easily as the strangers in Zaria's imagination might have. 2 days later she reappeared, this time waiting patiently outside the museum's entrance. holding a manila folder instead of a business card, her expression calm rather than insistent. She did not push or plead, and she made no attempt to follow Zarya when she first tried to walk past. Instead, she simply opened the folder and held out a single photograph, an old one, its edges soft with age and its colors faded to gentle sepia tones. It showed a small girl, no older than 3, dark eyes wide and curious, wearing a pendant around her neck that matched exactly the one now resting in Zarya's coat pocket, the same unusual engraving, catching the light in both images, decades apart. The photograph had been taken, Vivian explained quietly, 35 years earlier, in a city Zarya had never once visited in her adult life. "We have been searching for you," Vivian said, her voice softening for the first time since their initial encounter, "for almost your entire life. There is a family," she continued, "an old and powerful one, that has never stopped looking, and everything in our research points toward you." Zarya stared at the photograph for a long time, her pulse loud in her ears. She wanted to dismiss it as coincidence, as manipulation, as anything other than what it appeared to be. But the pendant in her pocket felt suddenly heavier, and something in the child's expression in that faded photograph tugged at a memory she did not know she carried. Still, she was not a woman who surrendered her judgment easily. She told Vivian she would consider the request, nothing more, and walked away with the photograph burned into her mind. That night, she barely slept, turning the pendant over and over in her hand, as though it might whisper an answer if she listened closely enough. Word travels quickly among people who thrive on gossip, and somehow, within days, Ethan learned of the strange visitor and her even stranger claims. He arrived at Zarya's new apartment unannounced, his expression somewhere between amusement and disdain. He had heard, he said, that she was entertaining some fantasy about a wealthy family searching for a lost daughter, and he could not resist a laugh. "The richest family in the world," he said, shaking his head as though the idea itself was an embarrassment. "Please, Zarya, don't turn yourself into a joke chasing something that isn't real." His words landed with the same familiar sting she had grown used to over the years. But this time something in her had already shifted. She did not argue with him. She simply watched him as he spoke, noticing, perhaps for the first time clearly, how small his cruelty made him look rather than her, how the confident lawyer she had once admired now sounded almost frightened, as though the mere possibility of her story being true threatened something fragile in him. He pressed further, warning her that if she pursued this fantasy, she would only humiliate herself further once the truth came out, that wealthy families did not simply materialize with lost heirs the way stories claimed, that somewhere behind Vivian's polished folder there was almost certainly a con artist waiting to take advantage of a vulnerable, recently divorced woman. Zarya let him finish. She did not interrupt, did not defend herself, did not explain the photograph, or the pendant, or the letter, still folded carefully in her nightstand drawer. He slid the finalized divorce papers across her kitchen counter and told her, almost as an afterthought, that she should stop using his last name once everything was official, as though her name had ever truly belonged to him in the first place. Zarya signed without hesitation, her handwriting steady, her expression unreadable. She did not beg him to stay. She did not ask him to reconsider. She simply signed, slid the papers back across the counter, and told him, in a voice calmer than she felt, to see himself out. In the weeks that followed, Zarya agreed to the testing Vivian had requested, more out of a need to settle the question in her own mind than any real belief that the story could be true. A private clinic arranged by the Blackwell family office collected the sample discreetly, and Zarya returned to her ordinary life, cataloging shipping manifests from the 1800s, eating dinner alone, trying not to think too hard about a photograph of a child who might or might not have been her. She told herself, repeatedly, not to hope for anything. Hope, in her experience, tended to arrive right before disappointment. The results came back with a certainty that left no room for doubt. The match exceeded 99.9%, a number so definitive that even the most skeptical geneticist in the family's employ could not argue with it. Vivian called her personally to deliver the news, and Zarya remembered standing in her small kitchen afterward, the phone still warm in her hand, staring at nothing in particular for a long while, trying to absorb a truth too large to fit inside an ordinary evening. Within 2 days, August Blackwell himself, founder of Blackwell Global and one of the wealthiest men on the planet, arrived at Zaria's apartment building in a convoy long enough to stop traffic for several blocks. Neighbors gathered at their windows, phones forgotten in their hands, watching the spectacle of black vehicles and quiet security details lining a street more accustomed to delivery trucks and stray cats. He stepped out of the lead vehicle alone, waving off the assistance offered by his security team, an elderly man with silver hair and eyes that seemed to have carried grief for decades. When Zaria opened her door, he did not offer a handshake or a formal greeting. He knelt, right there in the hallway, his knees against the worn carpet runner, and told her, his voice breaking in a way that surprised even his own staff, that he was sorry it had taken 35 years to find her. She stood frozen for a moment, unsure whether to help him to his feet or simply let him finish, and in the end, she knelt down beside him instead, meeting him at eye level, an instinct that seemed to move him even more than her willingness to accept his apology. Behind him, his security team and a handful of staff members stood in respectful silence, several visibly moved by the sight of a man who commanded industries across the globe reduced, in that narrow hallway, to something entirely human. The story unraveled slowly over the following days, pieced together through old police files and family records that Vivian and her team had spent years chasing. Decades earlier, when Zaria was barely more than an infant, a failed kidnapping attempt targeting the Blackwell family had gone catastrophically wrong. The plan, as investigators later reconstructed it, had involved a driver bribed by rival business interests, a car meant to disappear into the countryside, and a ransom demand that was never delivered because the operation collapsed within hours of the abduction. In the chaos that followed, the child had been abandoned outside a small church, in a city far from where the family lived, left with nothing but the pendant around her neck and no note explaining who she was. A young priest had found her at dawn, wrapped in a blanket on the church steps, and had done everything he could to trace her origins, before eventually placing her, through proper channels, with an adoption agency that had no way of connecting an infant with no documentation to a family several states away. The Blackwells had searched for years, hiring investigators, chasing false leads across continents, offering rewards that drew thousands of false claims and endless disappointment, never once giving up, despite decade after decade of silence. August had personally reviewed every lead himself for the first 10 years, then delegated the search to a dedicated team that never fully disbanded even when hope grew thin. The story, once it reached the press, spread with the force of a hurricane, dominating headlines and stunning a public that had never imagined such a quiet, humble woman could be connected to one of the most powerful families alive. Reporters camped outside the museum where she worked, and for several days her ordinary routines became impossible, replaced by a strange new reality where strangers recognized her face from television broadcasts and shouted questions she had no interest in answering. Zaria's first visit to the Blackwell estate felt like stepping into a world built from a different set of physical laws. The car passed through a gate flanked by quiet security details, wound along a drive lined with old trees, and finally arrived at a house so vast it seemed less like a residence and more like a small institution. Marble hallways stretched longer than entire city blocks. A helicopter rested on a private pad near the eastern wing, and beyond the windows she could see stables, gardens, and a stretch of coastline that belonged, impossibly, entirely to one family. Private staff moved quietly through rooms filled with art she recognized from museum catalogs, pieces she had once described in academic papers, now hanging casually on walls, as though they were simple decorations rather than pieces worth small fortunes. She learned, in careful, measured conversations with August and Vivian over the following days, the full scope of what the family controlled: a banking empire spanning dozens of countries, an aviation division, cutting-edge artificial intelligence research, pharmaceutical manufacturing that touched millions of lives, energy infrastructure that powered entire regions, and a charitable foundation considered among the largest in the world. August walked her through it patiently, never once rushing her, watching her reactions closely, as though relearning who she was through the questions she chose to ask. He seemed almost relieved each time she skipped past a figure or evaluation to ask instead about the people involved, the workers, the history, the human cost behind each acquisition. None of it moved her the way it seemed to move everyone around her. She had grown up with little, raised by a woman who worked 2 jobs and still found time to read her bedtime stories, and the sudden proximity to unimaginable wealth left her strangely unaffected. What she wanted, what she asked August directly during their second private conversation, was simply to understand why she had been left behind, why 35 years had passed before anyone found her, and whether the people responsible for that failed kidnapping had ever been held accountable. August answered every question honestly, his voice heavy with regret, explaining the frantic search efforts of decades past, the false leads, the private investigators who had grown old and died still searching, the family's refusal to ever officially declare her lost for good. Meanwhile, in a world far removed from marble hallways and private jets, Ethan sat in his office and watched the news coverage unfold on a muted television screen, his coffee growing cold beside him. He read the headlines twice, then a third time, as though repetition might change their meaning. The woman he had mocked for supposedly living inside a fabricated story was now confirmed, through science and law and the testimony of one of the richest men alive, to be the long-lost heir of the Blackwell family. He sat frozen at his desk for a long while, the ambitious calculations that usually ran constantly behind his eyes, falling completely silent. A junior associate knocked twice before entering, and Ethan waved him away without a word, unable to form a coherent sentence for the first time in his career. The reaction from the people who had once surrounded Zarya and Ethan was almost theatrical in its speed and shamelessness. Old friends who had drifted away during the divorce suddenly resurfaced with warm messages and invitations to reconnect, as though years of silence had never happened. Colleagues of Ethan's, the very partners who had once questioned Zarya's lack of pedigree at that fateful gala, now sought her out directly, offering congratulations dressed up as friendship, some even claiming they had always sensed something remarkable about her, a claim Zarya found almost amusing given how thoroughly they had ignored her for years. The social circles that had once measured her worth by her family connections now scrambled to prove they had always believed in her, always respected her, always known she was destined for something greater. Invitations arrived by the dozen, dinners and galas and charity events, each one hoping to claim some small proximity to the woman who had, seemingly overnight, become one of the most discussed figures in the country. Zarya watched the transformation with a quiet, unimpressed clarity. She understood exactly what was happening, the same performance she had witnessed her entire marriage, only now amplified and pointed directly at her rather than around her. She was not interested in playing along, and she declined the vast majority of invitations without a second thought, choosing instead to spend her evenings with August and Vivian, learning the family history she had missed. Ethan, too, eventually found his way back to her, requesting a meeting through Vivian's office, rather than simply appearing unannounced this time, a small sign that even he understood the ground beneath him had shifted. Vivian relayed the request with visible reluctance, warning Zarya she was under no obligation to grant it. But Zarya agreed anyway, curious more than anything to see what remained of the man she had once loved for nearly a decade. When they finally sat across from each other in a private room at the Blackwell estate, he looked older than she remembered, the confidence that once defined him replaced by something closer to desperation, his hands restless in his lap, his eyes darting occasionally to the ornate furnishings around them, as though even now, some part of him could not help calculating what it all might be worth. He told her the divorce had been a mistake, born of pressure and ambition, that the person who spoke those cruel words at the gala had not truly been him, that beneath everything he had never stopped loving her, that the man in that ballroom had been a stranger, wearing his face. Zarya listened without interrupting, the same patience she had always carried, though now it felt less like submission and more like control. When he finished, she asked him a single question, the only one that mattered. She asked whether, if none of this had happened, if she had remained exactly the woman he divorced, unremarkable and unconnected, he would have ever come looking for her at all. Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it. He searched for an answer, any answer, but nothing honest came, and his silence told her everything she needed to know. She thanked him for coming, wished him well, and left the room without looking back. The museum where Zarya worked issued a brief statement supporting her privacy, and her supervisor, a soft-spoken woman named Patricia, who had mentored her for years, quietly rearranged her schedule to shield her from the worst of the attention. Zarya continued cataloging records during that strange, overwhelming stretch of weeks, finding a strange comfort in the routine of it, in the fact that old ledgers and shipping manifests did not care who her grandfather was. Not everyone within the family's orbit welcomed Zarya's arrival with open arms. A distant relative of the Blackwell line, a man named Roland Blackwell, who had spent years positioning himself as a potential heir to portions of the family's fortune, watched Zarya's sudden emergence with barely concealed panic. He had spent nearly a decade cultivating relationships with board members, attending every function, offering himself quietly as the future face of the family's philanthropic branch, certain that August, without a direct descendant, would eventually turn toward him. Her presence threatened to unravel years of careful maneuvering on his part. And rather than accept the outcome gracefully, he chose to fight it in the shadows, quietly reaching out to contacts in the financial press who owed him favors from prior dealings. Whispers began circulating among certain financial circles and gossip columns, suggesting that the genetic results had been falsified, that the entire reunion was an elaborate scheme orchestrated by opportunists looking to siphon wealth from an aging, grief-stricken old man who could no longer trust his own judgment. The rumors grew bolder with each passing day, some outlets going so far as to question August's mental competence, a suggestion that wounded him far more deeply than any attack on Zarya herself. The accusations spread quickly, the way manufactured scandal always does, faster than truth and twice as loud. Financial columnists who had never met either party speculated openly about motive and opportunity, and for a few uneasy days, the story threatened to overshadow everything Zarya had begun to build. She found herself, for the first time since the reunion, doubted by strangers who had never known her at all, and the sensation felt uncomfortably familiar, the same dismissive suspicion she had once heard in her own husband's voice. Vivian, who had spent years of her career building the very case that confirmed Zarya's identity, refused to let the lie stand unchallenged. She launched an immediate and thorough investigation, pulling every original record connected to the case, security footage from the church, where the infant had been discovered decades earlier, handwritten police logs from officers long since retired, and multiple independent genetic analyses conducted by laboratories with no connection to the family whatsoever. She worked through nights, cross-referencing timestamps and signatures, determined that no fabricated rumor would be allowed to erase decades of patient, careful searching. Piece by piece, the manufactured scandal collapsed under the weight of verified, layered evidence, and Roland's desperate attempt to protect his inheritance unraveled into public embarrassment instead, his own financial dealings drawing far more scrutiny than hers ever had. Through it all, August began pressing Zarya to accept a more formal role within the family's empire, offering her positions of significant authority across various branches of Blackwell Global, from the philanthropic arm to a seat on the board that oversaw the entire enterprise. She considered the offers carefully, sitting with each one for days at a time, unwilling to simply accept a life of luxury she had not earned and did not particularly want. She spoke often with Vivian during this period, the two women developing an easy trust, as Vivian walked her through the practical realities of running a family office of such enormous scale. Instead of the traditional path August had imagined, she proposed something different, something that reflected the values her adoptive mother had instilled in her long before any of this began, values built on patience, honesty, and quiet service rather than spectacle. She asked August to help her establish a foundation dedicated to finding lost and missing children, alongside a family reunification center staffed with counselors and investigators, and a free, accessible genetic database designed to help others avoid the decades of uncertainty she herself had endured. She spent weeks drafting the framework herself, drawing on her archival training to design a system capable of cross-referencing records buried in agencies that rarely spoke to one another. August agreed without hesitation, moved as much by the proposal itself as by the quiet strength with which she delivered it. He redirected a portion of the family's philanthropic budget toward the initiative within days, insisting that it become the flagship project of the Blackwell Foundation rather than a minor addition. For the first time in the family's long and complicated history, the Blackwell name appeared in headlines, not for the size of its fortune or the reach of its influence, but for the compassion behind a new initiative that had already, within its first months, reunited dozens of families who had spent years, in some cases entire lifetimes, searching for missing relatives. Letters arrived by the hundreds, some from strangers thanking her for a reunion made possible by the database, others simply expressing gratitude that such a resource now existed at all. Journalists who once wrote about the family's business acquisitions now wrote about the woman who had transformed personal tragedy into public good, a shift in coverage that August admitted, quietly, meant more to him than any financial headline ever had. The day arrived when the family formally announced Zaria as heir to a significant portion of the Blackwell legacy, a ceremony held in a grand hall filled with press, extended family, and dignitaries from around the world. The hall had been transformed for the occasion, tall arrangements of white flowers lining the aisle, soft light falling across rows of guests who had traveled from every corner of the world to witness the moment. Cameras lined the room, their operators jostling gently for position, and outside, crowds gathered simply to witness, even from a distance, a moment that had already captured the attention of millions. Vivian stood near the front, dressed sharply as always, watching the proceedings with the satisfaction of someone who had spent years fighting for a truth the world had finally accepted. August sat in the front row, his hands folded, his eyes rarely leaving Zaria as she moved through the final preparations backstage. Ethan arrived as well, uninvited but somehow present anyway, having used a connection from a former colleague to secure a seat near the back of the room, standing quietly with the fragile hope that perhaps, in front of everyone, she might offer him one final chance. Zaria walked to the front of the hall in a simple, elegant dress, entirely unlike the extravagant gowns worn by others in attendance that evening, a deliberate choice that August later admitted had brought tears to his eyes before she even reached the podium. She did not search the crowd for Ethan's face. She did not acknowledge him at all. Instead, she looked out at the sea of unfamiliar faces, at August standing proudly to one side, at Vivian watching with quiet satisfaction, and at the empty chair beside her mother's old photograph, which she had asked to have placed near the front of the hall in quiet tribute. She began to speak, her voice steady and unhurried, carrying easily through the silent room. She told the room that some people believed a person's worth was measured by their bloodline, their bank accounts, or the status attached to their name. She spoke of the woman who raised her, who worked long hours and still found time to read her stories every night, who never once made her feel incomplete despite not knowing where she came from. She spoke of the years of uncertainty, the letter she had carried in silence, the pendant she now wore openly rather than hidden beneath her collar. But what made her worthy of standing where she stood that evening, she said, had nothing to do with being a Blackwell. It came instead from every year she spent not knowing who she was, and choosing, in spite of that uncertainty, to remain honest, to remain kind, and to never betray the woman she knew herself to be, even when no one else could confirm her worth for her. The hall rose to its feet in applause that seemed to stretch on for minutes, the sound echoing off marble walls that had witnessed countless galas and ceremonies, but perhaps never one quite so genuine. Ethan stood near the back, his applause slow and hollow, watching the woman he once dismissed as living inside a lie now standing at the center of truth, poised, whole, and entirely unbothered by his presence. He turned and left quietly before the ceremony concluded, understanding at last that he had lost the most valuable person in his life, not because she had changed into someone new, but because he had allowed his own ambition to change him into someone unworthy of her. Later that night, long after the crowds had dispersed and the estate had settled into its familiar quiet, Zarya stood alone in front of a wall, newly filled with family photographs, some old and faded, others taken in recent weeks since her arrival. She studied the faces of relatives she was still learning to know, cousins and aunts, and a grandfather who had never once stopped searching for her, and she felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, a sense of belonging that had nothing to do with wealth or status. What brought the quiet smile to her face that night was not the fortune now attached to her name, nor the influence she now carried across industries she had never imagined touching. It was simpler than that. It was the understanding that dignity and integrity, the very qualities Ethan had once mocked as worthless without connections or lineage, had ultimately carried her further than any inheritance ever could. She had spent 35 years not knowing where she came from, and in the end, it was not blood that led her home. It was the woman she had chosen to remain throughout every year of not knowing at all. In the months that followed, the foundation she built grew steadily, reuniting family after family who had spent years, sometimes decades, searching for answers the way she once had. She continued her work at the museum part-time, unwilling to abandon the career she had built with her own hands long before anyone knew her name meant anything at all. She kept the pendant close, wearing it every day, not as a symbol of the fortune it had ultimately unlocked, but as a reminder of the letter that once told her, in a moment of complete uncertainty, that she would one day know exactly who she was. Vivian remained a constant presence in her life, evolving from a cautious investigator into something closer to a trusted friend, someone who had believed in the truth of Zarya's identity long before the world caught up to the same conclusion. They met often for coffee away from the estate, conversations that had little to do with business and everything to do with the quiet rebuilding of a life interrupted. August, too, grew closer with each passing month, the two of them slowly filling in 35 years of missing history over quiet dinners and long conversations, grief and joy tangled together in equal measure, old photographs spread across the table between them, each one prompting a story neither had known, the other was missing. He often told her that finding her had been the single greatest relief of his long life, greater than any business achievement, greater than any fortune he had built across decades of careful work, and he began, slowly, to introduce her to cousins and relatives, scattered across the family's wider circle, each meeting adding another thread to the tapestry of belonging she had never expected to weave. A quiet man named Desmond Blackwell, her father's younger brother, became something of an unofficial guide during her early months, walking her through family customs and old stories with the patience of someone who understood exactly how disorienting sudden belonging could feel. As for Ethan, he faded from the story, the way people often do once their role in someone else's transformation has ended. He remained at his firm, still ambitious, still chasing the markers of status he had once believed mattered most, though those who knew him well noticed a quieter version of the man who had once mocked a woman for not knowing her own worth, someone who laughed a little less easily at gatherings and spoke a little more carefully about the people around him. Whatever regret lived inside him, he carried alone, having learned, far too late, that the very thing he dismissed as valueless turned out to be the rarest thing he would ever have the privilege of losing. He never remarried, and colleagues who worked closely with him sometimes noticed him pause, mid-conversation, whenever her name happened to surface in passing. Zarya, for her part, rarely thought of him at all anymore. Her days filled instead with purpose, with family finally found, with the quiet satisfaction of building something meaningful out of a lifetime spent without answers. She had once believed the most painful moment of her life was hearing her husband call her existence a lie in front of a room full of strangers. She understood now that pain had simply been a door, closing on one chapter so an entirely different one could begin, one written not by circumstance or bloodline, but by the steady, unshakable integrity she had carried with her the entire time, waiting patiently for the world to finally catch up.